Hello, this is Pastor Scott Conway at QXChurch. You can find us online at QXChurch.org. We are on the Resilient Faith series, lesson number 5. And here we're talking about God. We've been working our way from whether or not there even is a God, and we talked about a creator God, and we're working our way more and more into the Bible. Now, what I promised you last time is that we were going to land in the Bible. Now, if there is a God, who is he? Now, some things from creation can inform us just a little bit about a creator. We already looked at the need for him to be outside time and space. Because if he's big enough, if he's powerful enough to create space, in some way, shape, or form, he has to be outside of space. But we know that space and time are interactive. So that means he also has to be outside of time. So he's creating space, he's creating time, and he's creating matter. In order to create matter, he needs to be all-powerful. So he's creating time, he's creating space, he's creating matter, so in some way, shape, or form, he must be outside time, outside space, and have enough power to do that matter-power conversion. Because we know that matter cannot be created or destroyed, it can only be converted. That energy and matter are essentially the same thing. So if you're going to create matter out of nothing, the nothing, we'll put nothing in quotes, that you're going to create matter out of has to be power, has to be some form of energy. Now in the universe, we know we have physics. Physics are the rules of the universe. Now some of these rules we're trying to figure out, a lot of these rules we have figured out. Science is the study and exploration of rules in the universe. And so we're using science to try to figure out what are the rules. Many rules have been defined, others are still being discovered, and from time to time we revise our understanding of the rules as we get more information. Sometimes we find out that our understanding was inadequate, sometimes we find out our understanding was wrong. Sometimes we find out that we were on the right path, and every once in a while we stumble across something that we had no idea was there. And it just gets to be an amazing discovery. In fact, one of the things that I was told recently, being a Star Wars fan from way back, Tatooine, a planet with two suns. One of the things I remember learning growing up is, well, that's just science fantasy. It's not possible for a two-sun system to have planets. Well, I just found out through a friend of a friend who works in astronomy that they have found a binary sun that actually has two planets they've been able to confirm. So maybe one of them is Tatooine, who knows? But that's what science does. Science is the art of finding the rules, and we're pretty good at it. We don't have this thing totally nailed, and there's some science we're less willing to do because there's some ethics involved in it. But we do a pretty darn good job of figuring stuff out. Now, technology is about applying the rules of the universe. Science finds the rules, tries to understand the rules. Technology seeks to make use of the rules in order to produce results. If technology successfully follows the relevant rules, it produces the intended result. And if technology does not, or if it cannot, then it will not produce the intended result. And from time to time, technology, which is just applied science, just doesn't work. Doesn't work, but it doesn't work sometimes in amazing ways, because it manages to stumble across other rules that let us make something else work. Like the invention of rubber. I remember reading a story about the invention of rubber. They're actually trying to invent a form of plastic that would stay soft even when it cooled. And they're having just an incredibly difficult time trying to do this. And there's one particular scientist or engineer, or whoever was doing this, was trying to fiddle with this stuff at home, and he drops it on the stove. And he gets it off, and he checks it, and it's flexible. And he screams, he goes running outside into the snow. His family has no idea what's going on. Plunges into the snow, pulls it out, it's still flexible, and he's yelling and he's screaming. He seems so excited about this gunk he has in his hand. And what apparently he figured out, and I don't know enough about rubber to know if how this works or not, but that the problem they ran into, that they just stumbled across completely by accident, is that you had to heat it up again in order to get it to stay soft. And they stumbled across that on accident. Why that's that way, I don't know. They might know now, but they didn't know then. So a lot of science we stumble across completely on accident, because there's no manual that lays out all of the scientific rules of the universe. Now, something else about creation. if this is a creation, if an infinite intelligence with sufficient power, with perfect wisdom and love, really did create the universe, we have another problem. Is it broken? Because science and technology shows us that the universe works. But on the other hand, we also see evidence that the universe is breaking. We call it entropy. We see natural disasters. We see catastrophes. Even colliding galaxies. Imagine what kind of damage colliding galaxies are doing. You have entire solar systems slowly, at least, slowly by the way we perceive time, crashing into each other. Whole suns folding into one another. Planets maybe slamming into one another. Who knows how much damage is happening out there? You have black holes. Black holes also doing damage on the cosmic scale, just sucking things up. Entire planets, entire solar systems. Imagine if there's a civilization. Imagine if a black hole comes into our solar system and starts sucking up our planets. I mean, it could destroy all of life. Who knows how much damage some of these things are doing? Universal, planetary, and certainly in our individual lives, we see really bad things happen. That if you get down to an individual level, all of us have had really bad things happen somewhere near us. Maybe in our own lives, maybe this week, maybe this morning, who knows? But we know really bad things happen. And science tells us that we're on a steady march toward the heat death of the universe. That this whole thing that was set up is in some way winding down. It's winding down to this ultimate place where everything's broken, nothing's working. So what do we do with all of this? What are our options? Pardon me. So when we're working our way forward, when we're trying to understand the universe, and we look at some of these things, we go, okay, creation, all of these rules, trying to figure out the technology so that we can be following the rules of science, that the universe works on rules, but the whole thing's winding down, the whole thing's breaking. Bad things happen. If there really is a God, why are all these bad things happen? If there's a God so powerful, so smart that he could make the whole thing, then why is it breaking? And in fact, if he's so powerful he could make the whole thing in the first place, why doesn't he just fix it? Why doesn't he just remake it perfect? If something happened and it broke, why doesn't he just fix it? And you could sit around and you could go back and forth and be guessing, but you don't have to do that all by yourself. We do have some options. If you're going to look for belief groups, you're going to look for people that say, well, hey, we have some answers. Let's look at some broad categories. The top 5. The top 5 belief groups are Christian, Muslim, non-religious, Hindu, and Buddhist. These top 5 belief groups account for most of the population of the world. In fact, when you just get to the top 3 belief groups, you've already gotten most of the population of the world. In fact, it only takes the top 2. The majority of the population of the world actually claims to be either Christian or Muslim. And they have something in common, Genesis 1:1. But the numbers that we have, there's about 2.4 billion Christians. It's not more than half the population of the world, it's less than half. But then you have 1.65 billion Muslims. Both the Christians and the Muslims use the Old Testament account in the Bible for their creation story. Now there's various levels of believing in it, whether they think it's sort of a generic, well yeah, God created the heavens and the earth in, kind of some vague sort of way. Some of them are very concrete creationists, some of them are young earth creationists, some of them are old earth creationists. But they believe in some way, shape, or form God created the heavens and the earth, that there is a God. Both of them clearly believe that, and that God is our creator, and both of them clearly believe that. About 1.12 billion people claim no religious affiliation. So they're going to tend to be more of the Big Bang group, maybe the Big Bounce group, but in general probably Big Bang. There's about 1 billion Hindus. Of the 1 billion Hindus, they believe mostly in a Big Bounce sort of approach. And about 376 million Buddhists. Now, modern Buddhism kind of holds their old creation stories very, very loosely. In fact, they actually don't see them as dogmatic and doctrinal. They see them more as just stories, allegories, ways you can kind of learn about life, and they really do see it as mythology. But it's like useful mythology. And so if science stands against one of their ancient stories, they really don't care. They go, okay, well, we'll just go with the science. That they see this is a place we can learn how to live. These stories are places we can learn how to get along in the universe. But we're not committed to them having to be literally true. Most Christians, most Muslims who believe their Bible want their Bible to be sufficiently literally true so that they can really trust in the rest of it at some level for their lives. So both Christians and Muslims generally use Genesis 1:1. The non-religious will believe some form of the Big Bang, or they simply don't think about it. Hindu and Buddhism don't deal with ultimate origins. They don't have a first cause. They have some form of the Big Bounce, which, as we explained before, do not use first cause. They go into this universe was created from a singularity that existed because a previous universe collapsed, but then they don't explain the previous universe other than, well, there was one before that and one before that. So ask them, well, what was the very first universe? They don't know. It's just an infinite progression. And Buddhism in particular is known to simply accept science over any ancient Buddhist stories. And that's from no less authority than the Dalai Lama himself. So that's what he says. So the only view in here that really answers the first cause is Genesis 1:1. So of all of these top 5 groups, you only have one answer to first cause, Genesis 1:1. And as we already discussed, in order for a God to create time and create space, he has to, in some way, shape, or form, be outside of time and outside of space. And so if we start to look at the Bible, it says, okay, we have this one sentence at the beginning of the Bible. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. In the beginning, that in some way, shape, or form, there was an ultimate beginning. In the beginning, and that's kind of the way this is phrased in Hebrew, that there's some ultimate start to things. So at the beginning of time, God, and we just stop right there for a moment. So in the beginning, God was already there. God's already part of the equation, even though we're at the beginning. So it doesn't say in the beginning, God appeared. It's in the beginning, God already was. He's already there. That when time comes into existence, God is already there. And so in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now we know as we're conceptualizing things from science, he created the heavens, he creates the earth, and some people look at this as it's energy and it's matter, or it's space and it's substance. But he's creating time, he's creating space, he's creating galaxies, he's creating solar systems and suns and planets and everything that's out there. The basic point is it did not happen by itself. So if you boil Genesis 1:1, if you make allowances for it to be poetry, you make allowances for it to be metaphor, the basic point is it didn't happen by itself. It was done. Creation was created. It's not that the universe just suddenly was, and no explanations. It suddenly was because it was suddenly made. Now another important point, and we get this out of Genesis 2, is it broke. It was perfect. You think of perfect as maximum order. A zero entropy environment. Nothing's breaking. Everything's perfect. And there was no death. No entropy. Nothing's wearing down. If you were alive, your body's going to be perfect. You're not going to age. You're not going to break. You're not going to get sick. Nothing bad's going to happen. So maximum order, no entropy, that'd be a pretty decent deal, wouldn't it? And you get into this Genesis narrative, and you find out that Adam and Eve are given dominion, whatever dominion means. And in Genesis 3, we learn about the fall. And the basic point of the fall is Adam and Eve broke it. It wasn't broke, and then it is broke. We're told there was no death, but then afterwards there is death. And in the narrative, Adam and Eve are held responsible for this. Now, is it possible from a purely scientific perspective that the entire universe had zero entropy, that the entire universe had perfect order, and some human being changes the entire order of the entire universe? Well, that's kind of the implications in this narrative. If you make allowances for it to be poetry, metaphor, however you want to look at it, you can back it off to the basic point of it was perfect and then it got broken. Somebody broke it. It didn't used to be busted, but now it's busted. And so if you work from that, keeping in account the Genesis account is written in poetic form. Now, in poetic form, that means it might be literal. Or it might be metaphorical. Just as human language uses poetry and metaphor to express ideas, there's really no reason that someone communicating with humans might not do the same. And think about this as adults. If you're talking to a bunch of 5- and 6-year-olds, don't you use different vocabulary? Don't you use simpler ideas? Don't you use simpler metaphors? Don't you try to figure, well, it's kind of like, in that television program you watch, and you're talking about cartoons to try to explain some life lesson. I mean, I've done that. So when you're communicating with someone, you're communicating with a group, you're going to try to figure out a way you can communicate in a way that they can accept it. And one of the particular beauties of trying to communicate a creation story, because you're talking about an ultimate origin, you're probably going to kind of blow some people's minds here. But if you tell it in poetic form, if you organize it in such a way that, if you get it, you get it. If you don't, you don't. Don't worry about it. I'm just kind of laying it out for you here. And to whatever level you understand it, that's great. To whatever level you don't, that's fine. Just treat it as a story. And you can study it later. You can get into it later. And right now, we have this whole field of science. And I know if you're like a hardcore scientist, you go, well, that's pseudoscience, it's not real science. But people studying, trying to figure out Genesis, trying to figure out creation. I mean, they're sort of hanging their hats in Genesis 1 through 3 and trying to figure out, what's the deal here? How does this work scientifically? And they come up with all sorts of things. Some of the stuff is really, really good. Some of the stuff, not so much. But they're trying. You think about early science, well, what was early science doing? They came up with some really good stuff and some stuff, not so much. At least by modern standards. So I trust as this particular field of study continues to move forward, they're going to get better. Right now, they're pretty much theologically hanging their hats on Genesis, and they're trying to work forward from there. There's some science issues there. They also do have a tendency to hang on to a theory until they have something else to replace it, instead of saying, okay, well, that one's been falsified, we're going to let it go. So, well, what do you think happened? Well, we don't know. We're going to keep studying, we're going to figure it out. And that's really the way they should be doing things. And I've gone to the Institute for Creation Research on a field trip, and we kind of went room by room by room, talking about the issues with some of the things, even some of the things that have been pretty thoroughly debunked already, but they had held on to it, even though it had been debunked. We saw a display, for instance, talking about the idea that all of the fossils were laid down in Noah's flood. And one of the ideas put forth was this concept called hydraulic sorting. The idea of hydraulic sorting is basically, well, if you look at them, they're kind of organized by size, and that when the waters flow back and forth, they do tend to sort things out by size. By the way, is that true? Yeah, that's true. Except, it's the opposite of how the fossils are laid out. That when you have hydraulic sorting, you have the waters moving back and forth. The big things tend to settle down first, and the smaller things, and the smaller things, and the smaller things. So then there's kind of the weight of the particles. I think like your salad dressing is going to sort out based upon the relative, weight of the material compared to the weight of the other material. But the big things are the things, if they're all made out of the same stuff, the big things as waters move are the things that kind of settle down first. The small things kind of keep moving. If hydraulic sorting explained the order of the stratification of the fossils, everything should be practically backwards. Here's the thing, not totally backwards. Because you have small stuff, then medium-sized stuff, and then larger stuff, then really big stuff, but then you have smaller stuff again. So hydraulic sorting can't explain it. Now, I don't know if they're still talking about hydraulic sorting because I'm not following that. I haven't done a field trip to such a museum in a long time. But that one got debunked way early on. And one of the lead scientists that was involved in this institute should have known that because he was a hydraulic scientist. He worked with water as part of his field of study That's what he got his PhD in. He should have known better because he was trained for an industry that uses hydraulic sorting to sort out the big stuff from the little stuff. So that sometimes you have some scientific honesty area problems because they're so focused on Genesis has to be true that sometimes they were, at least were, and this could be 15 years ago, getting a little bit too flexible with their science. Because rather than trying to find out, they were trying to prove a point. And real science needs to be more focused on finding out and letting the evidence take you wherever it goes. And part of that means that you can hold on to your large theory. I mean, evolution has tons of holes in it too. And they hold on to the evolutionary theory. But when a particular individual hypothesis has been debunked, you let it go. It's been falsified. We know that's not the answer. No, I personally think I do know what the answer is, but that's not it. So the Genesis account is written in poetic form. It allows for it to be metaphorical. If I get to heaven and God explains to me, he's like, well, this is why I did it this way. It didn't quite happen the way we laid it out. It was in poetic form. But you know, Scott, it's a lot like when you say your wife is hot. And you take her temperature, and you find that her body temperature is completely normal. Are you lying? No, you're not lying. You're using a figure of speech. And that's why I had to describe it to them that way. Because remember, I'm talking to people 3,500 years ago. I can't write them a scientific journal. And I didn't even want to write them a scientific journal, and here's why. And he explains why. And, oh, okay, well, yeah, it makes perfect sense. Now I see why you would do it that way. So many take it literally, many take it metaphorically, many are in between. In broad brush terms, the Bible says, 1, it did not happen by itself. 2, it was better. And 3, it broke. Now the Bible story is only one of many that talk about life and men coming about by creation, intelligent or otherwise. There's story after story in mythology after mythology and belief systems all throughout the world dating back to antiquity about the creation of life or the creation of man. The point in all of them is life didn't happen by itself. It took some being, some God, some process that involved some sort of intelligence, some sort of divine power in order for life to come about. That spark of life already existed in some other being. The Bible is far from unique in this respect. What is unique is the non-religious belief that life did happen by itself. That consciousness came from non-consciousness. That morality came from non-morality. That life came from non-life. That creative and free will came from inanimate chemicals reacting, adapting, evolving by some semi-random or non-random mechanical process from elements to living things. That's the unique view. That sort of the majority view throughout all of time in some way, shape, or form says, well, life doesn't just happen by itself. It has to come from somewhere that already has some form of life. So the Bible's not terribly unique in that sense, and so that doesn't necessarily lead us back into the Bible. But that basic idea, which is a fundamental issue that very often the evolutionary science has to deal with, is trying to work with that concept of life from not life. And that's a big leap. That's a massive leap. And then even just going from life to some form of consciousness, self-awareness, is another big leap. And they kind of try to play it down sometimes if you talk to them, but you know, when you get in a really good intimate conversation, you say, well, yeah, that's an issue. But we kind of believe that that's kind of solved by the development of the brain and that, you know, there's various levels and stuff. But it is still an issue, and it is something to be addressed. Now, in the Bible, of course, you know, the universe works on rules. Does the Bible have rules? Yeah, of course the Bible has rules. 10 of these rules are famous. So the universe works on rules possibly designed by a creator God. If the Bible is a God book, if this God who created rules for the universe wants rules for human beings too, and is using a book in some way, shape, or form to communicate with us, do we have rules? And of course we have rules. Here's your 10 most famous rules. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an image. You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. Honor your father and your mother. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not give false testimony. You shall not covet. And that's the New International Version of it, just to keep our English easy. And then you have the big points in the Old Testament. When you're dealing with the big points in the Old Testament, you have Deuteronomy 6:4. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God. The Lord is one. Deuteronomy 6:5 follows up. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your might. And then we have Leviticus 19:18. Second half of this is love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. Now a lot of people don't realize that this Deuteronomy 6:4 and 5 is the big point to Jews. For the people who revere the Old Testament and really only the Old Testament, this is it for them. This is what goes up on their doorposts. This is the Shema. In fact, when it comes to Hebrew, this is the only verse I ever learned in Hebrew. Shema Israel, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. Followed with, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. And we have some interesting insights into this God. Hear, O Israel. Israel, listen to this. The Lord is our God. Adonai Eloheinu. Now, Adonai Eloheinu, not making my H's as hard as I need to. The Lord, and that's how they pronounce when it's actually the YHWH, is would more technically probably be Yahweh Eloheinu. That's a plural. That the Lord, singular, is our God's plural. That's an odd structure. Because you grow up with it, it's just part of the culture. They don't think about it, but it is an odd structure. The Lord is one. So somehow you have a plural and a one thing kind of going on at the same time here. And so it's just one of those interesting odd structures, that there's something going on here. And love your neighbor as yourself. A lot of people think of the Old Testament as the wrath of God, or the temper tantrum God. Well, if you keep in mind that you have 1,500 years of Bible history going on here, think, how many times did God get to the place where he says, okay, you know guys, that's it. We have to end this now. Not that many. Spread that over 1,500 years where he's looking at these human beings and say, okay, that's just out of control. We're going to have to stop that. Now think about this from a human perspective. Parents raising children. Do you sometimes get to the point with the kids where the kids are sometimes getting out of control? Why? Because they're kids. Where you have to say, okay, that's it. This has got to stop. Parents sometimes go, well, yeah, pretty much every day. Human beings do that in general. It's not just a kid thing. Even just look at human history over the last 100 years. Are there places where sometimes we as a society have watched the behavior of other societies and gone, hey, look, you pushed the line too far. We're not going to let that happen. We're going to put a stop to that. And you go to war. Where someone says, well, I want that country. And they go take it. You said, no. You don't get to just take the country. We're going to stop you. Might not even be our country. But we'll step up and do that. How many times has just human beings, mankind, done that in the last 100 years? How many times might God do that in 1,000 years, in 2,000 years, in 3,500 years, in 5,000 years? And what if all of those are recorded in the Bible? Well, that's really not that often. Just every once in a while, God gets to that place where he says, okay, look, So moving on to the New Testament. In the New Testament, we have Jesus. Now, one of the things about the New Testament a lot of people don't realize is that not just Christians use the New Testament. That in Islam, while they don't believe the New Testament is the Word of God in the same way Christians do, they believe in Jesus. That they see Jesus as one of the greatest prophets of God. That in the Quran, they even affirm the virgin birth. That there was something supernatural happening in the birth of Jesus Christ. And the affirmation of the virgin birth, not to be confused with the Immaculate Conception, but I'll talk about that in a second because that just came up this week too. That this one prophet was so unique that he was born without being conceived by a man. And that Mary was indeed a virgin when Jesus was conceived and when Jesus was born. So when people assault the virgin birth as obviously ridiculous, that's stupid, they're not just attacking a Christian belief, they're also attacking a Muslim belief. A belief held in some way, shape, or form by the majority of human beings. And when you get into Jesus and you talk to some Hindus and some Buddhists, they review Jesus as a great teacher. In fact, I've even seen some of my Buddhist friends and associates refer to Jesus as the great teacher. That short of the Buddha himself, Jesus was one of the most enlightened people in the universe ever. And they see him as an incarnation of the Buddha. So Jesus gets a lot of respect. So what's the point of the New Testament? The point of the New Testament is John 3:16. This is probably the single most memorized verse in the Bible. John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but shall have everlasting life. And that's kind of the verse that the whole New Testament revolves around. But John 3:17 adds, for God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him. Now, if you watch the behavior of some Christians as covered by the national media, it kind of seems like, well, the Christians are here to condemn the world. But the Bible tells us that when Jesus was here, he was here because God loved the world. He was here in some way so that whoever, which is kind of an interesting shift in things, whoever believes in him, that's kind of more of an individual thing. Suddenly God's about the individual. And we're beginning to learn some things about God, that it's not just about dealing with cultures and grand movements and cosmic scale things, that this can be personal. Shall not perish, but shall have everlasting life. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him. And suddenly we're at the big scale. So somehow this individual and the big work together. Then we have John 13:34. John 13:34 says, a new command I give to you, that you love one another, even as I have loved you, that you also love one another. Now what's interesting here is he says, a new command I give to you. Well, where? In the Old Testament we're already told, love God and love your neighbor. So what's new about this? That there's some new level of this. We're already told you're supposed to love your neighbor as yourself. In fact, when Jesus himself was asked, well, what is the great commandment? He doesn't go to the 10 Commandments. He doesn't talk about what the commandments are. He goes to the Shema. Not even the Deuteronomy 6:4 part. He goes to the part after that. That you will love the Lord your God with all of your heart, all of your soul, all of your mind, all of your strength. And this is the great commandment. This is the number one deal. But he doesn't stop there. He says, and the second is like the first. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. So they ask, what is the greatest commandment of God? The one. And he basically says, no, there's two. You can't stop at one, there's two. Love God, love your neighbor. And then later on he says, a new commandment I give to you, that you love one another. That is not just you're supposed to love people, kind of generally, love your neighbors, kind of in this kind of vague general senses, love one another. There's this reciprocity going on. You're supposed to have this love relationship deal going on. It's not just, well, you have the character of love and you're going to show people love and charity. It's, no, you're supposed to have this relationship. Look, you have a God creating the heavens and the earth. Genesis 1:1, cosmic scale stuff. And now you're coming down to one-on-one. Human beings connecting with other human beings for some reason is important to God. So the Old Testament big points. Number 1, love God. Number 2, love people. New Testament big points. God loves you. To remember, God loves you. Whoever you are, anywhere in the world. God doesn't just love Israel. God loves you as a person. God doesn't just love the world, the people. God loves you as a person, as an individual human being. And if you will believe, then you can have everlasting life, whatever that means. And it says, and you love people. You guys love each other. They're stepping it up to another level. It's like this progressive revelation of God's agenda that happens over the course of thousands of years. So what we've done so far, if we looked at it, we started with creation. Where did the universe come from? What's the first cause? Where did life come from? How does all this stuff happen? And that it doesn't happen by itself. So we work from the universe is to see it's very reasonable to believe in a God, not necessarily the God of the Bible, but some kind of creator, some kind of first cause, some kind of a source. And quite possibly it's more reasonable to believe in that than to believe in nothing. To think, oh, just came out of nothing. There was a singularity that is kind of, it just always was. That something always was. And if there is a God created the heavens and the earth, if there's a God that created space and time in some way, shape, or form, this guy's got to be outside of space and outside of time. Well, where did he come from is a time-based question, isn't it? Where did he start? Well, you go back in time, back in time, back in time, until there is no time. There's a beginning of time. And you take one step back past the beginning of time, and God's still there. So where did he have to come from? He didn't have to come from anywhere, because having a beginning is a time-based question. He's bigger than time. He's outside of time. He transcends time. However you want to understand that. Now what we do here is we call him omnitemporal. That means that to God, all time is now. That time doesn't apply to him the same way it applies to everyone else. And if you want to take E equals mc squared, the basic point of E equals mc squared is that energy and matter are basically the same thing. They convert one to another. The time and distance and energy and matter are in some way interactive, where they're all kind of connected to one another. And if you take your energy as infinite, well then how does the rest of it apply? Then you get, okay, well then what if distance is infinite? We would call that omnipresent. What if time is infinite? Well, we call it omnitemporal. What if the matter is infinite, or the matter is zero? Well, if zero, then that would be like a spiritual presence, an energetic presence. What if it's infinite? Well, then that would be all matter in the universe. And you see how you can start to play with these things and begin to get some idea of who this God has to be and how hard it would be to plug God into that equation. But it does give you a lot of the attributes of God, which it just so happens, maybe by coincidence, the Bible lines up with these things that we're really just beginning to understand in the last couple of 100 years. So, did it happen by itself? A lot of people want to believe that. Is it more reasonable to believe that, well, maybe it didn't happen by itself? I think so. At least to be open to the possibility it didn't happen by itself. That doesn't mean you stop scientific inquiry, but it means you be open to let the evidence take you anywhere it goes, even if it lands you at the doorstep of God. We've looked at a few things about the universe to tell us a little bit about such a God. And the majority view is Genesis 1:1. The majority view, just so everyone keeps in mind, just because something's a majority view, even a consensus view, doesn't necessarily mean it's true, does it? That you could have a bunch of people believe something and then have it later on be proven false. That happens all the time, doesn't it? You follow human history, we change your ideas. You follow science, guess what? They figure stuff out. Did you know that the speed of light has a speed? It's not infinite. That human beings, scientists, believed the speed of light was infinite for hundreds of years, thousands of years. They didn't believe light had a speed. It was just instantaneous. And it wasn't until sometime in the 1800s they began to figure out that, hey, maybe light does have a speed. So things change when we figure stuff out. Genesis 1:1 is consistent with what we know. We look at what we discover in the universe, and Genesis 1:1 is consistent with that. When you look at the Genesis account, if you allow for the poetry, it's not inconsistent with what we know. The Genesis creation story tells us the universe was created, that life was created, and that it was broken. And that's also consistent with what we know, that things break, things age, things die. So we can look to the Bible as a potential, not necessarily, well, see, that just proves the Bible. No, it doesn't. It gives us the Bible as a reasonable source of information. So, well, let's take a look at the Bible and see if the Bible absolutely contradicts what we know to be true. And if it doesn't absolutely contradict what we know to be true, then maybe we can use it as a resource. Well, let's see what else it has to say and work from there. So we look for the big points, and we're going to get into smaller points next time. We're looking for the big points right now. We see that there are rules. Just like in the universe, there are rules. It's no surprise there are rules. But it was fairly unique among religions, especially for the day. Here was a God who actually defined exactly what he expected. Not kind of this vague sort of, the priests can sort of almost make it up as they go along, but it's very concrete. Here are your rules. Here's rule number 1, rule number 2, rule number 3, rule number 4, rule number 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Let's lay it out in details. And even the Hebrew scholars will say things like, love God, love people. The rest is commentary. And a lot of it is, but he doesn't just leave it at these vague things and let the priests just make it all up as they go along from moment to moment and from day to day. One of the most unique things here is it got written down. You want to know if you're doing okay with God, check the list. If you're following the list, you're doing okay with God. If you're breaking the list, well, you're probably not doing okay with God. If you're in one of the ancient religions, what did that mean? It meant that whatever the priest said the sacrifice was, the sacrifice was. What about if you were Jewish? Well, it means that whatever the book says the sacrifice is, the sacrifice is. If things are abundant, do you bring more? No, it says this is what you bring. If you have a great year, that's what you bring. If you have a terrible year, that's what you bring. You bring your tithe, you bring your 10%. If you have a whole bunch, you don't have to give a higher percentage. If you have just a tiny bit, you don't have to give a higher percentage. There's no place where you say, well, clearly the gods must be angry. You must give a whole lot more because we must appease the gods. There's none of that. That was incredibly innovative. It's like, whoa, there's like actual real rules. You can actually know if you're getting along with this God. And that when you break one of the rules, you can know exactly what the sacrifice is. And there's like 2 tiers of sacrifice, so that if you have enough stuff, we'll sacrifice a lamb. If you don't have enough stuff, that's okay. Go catch a pigeon somewhere and just bring the pigeon in. Or, the dove, to be more precise. But, most of us don't go around capturing doves. But imagine if you're told, okay, if you have the resources, this is the sacrifice. If you don't, just go catch one of these and bring that in, and that'll be your sacrifice. And it's laid out for you. You don't have some priest thinking, well, our treasure's getting a little low, we could use a few more things. I'm kind of in the mood for some Taco Bell. So the gods have ordained that you must bring a sacrifice of Taco Bell. And the ancient priests could do stuff like that. Don't do stuff like that if you're Jewish, because it's all written down. Even in the 10 Commandments are consistent with the big points. Commandments 1 through 4 are about love God. So you look at Commandments 1 through 4 as the love God commandments. You shall have no other gods before me. Why? Because I'm the creator of the heavens and the earth. There are no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an image. It's like, I'm outside of time and space, guys. You can't make a statue of me. And you shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God. It's like, show some respect. And then remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. Then I rested on the seventh day, not because I was tired, but because it's just a day of rest. Just follow that, which honestly is about taking care of yourself. One of the things people learn is, it's really kind of handy if you stop and take a break. And then you look at the next commandments of love people. It's like, well, if you love people, honor your father and your mother. That when you're born and you're growing up, who are the first people you're going to come in contact with on a very consistent basis? Your parents. This is to honor them. It says, you shall not murder. So it's like, if you don't love people, don't kill them. You shall not commit adultery. If you've made a commitment, if you're promised in this relationship and you have promised fidelity, don't break the promise. This is the deal. And so that way, at the very least, when there's a kid coming, you know whose kid it is. You shall not steal. Like, it's someone else's stuff. You don't want people taking your stuff. You don't take their stuff. You shall not give false testimony to bear false witness. And this is more of a legal term. It's like, don't be telling stories intended to get people in trouble. But also, don't be telling stories intended to get people out of trouble that should be in trouble. That when there's a consequence, a legal consequence involved, just be honest about it, okay? And you shall not covet. And that's basically, don't go lusting after other people's stuff. And so you have the big points in the commandments. New Testament big points also included the Old Testament big points, but they were amplified. And something that was in the Old Testament was also found here again in a unique way, is God loves you. So if we're going to be using the Bible as a resource, we got some big points in here. So we need to love God, but God loves you. You need to have this sort of generic love for people, but you need to have this relational love. You need to be giving love to people who are giving love to you. It's not just that, you sacrifice and you give this kind of love. This relationship thing somehow is important to this God. Now, we've only dealt with the Bible in a very broad brush, because we haven't gotten into establishing the Bible as an authority. We haven't even gotten to the level yet we're establishing that we even know that the words in the Bible are really the words that were in the Bible originally, and we're going to do some of that next time. We haven't touched on how reliable it might be, whether it's the work of God or the work of people, whether it's literally true or maybe just a written docudrama sort of based on a true story. But even what we've done so far is matching up with what we know. So next time we're going to talk about the Bible itself in a bit more detail. Because we start off with, well, what do we know? Big picture. What's logical? What makes sense? Let's bring it to a slightly smaller picture. What's logical? What makes sense? We've got these 5 big categories of belief systems. Kind of, where do they start? Kind of, what do they think? And let's start taking a look at some of the majority view, minority view, some of the big views they have here. What makes sense? And we begin to see that the Bible stories are kind of believed by a whole bunch of people. Okay, well, let's take a look at them and see what the big issues are here, what the big points are here. This is still pretty consistent. So then if we're going to use the Bible, say, okay, well, the Bible's lining up. It's doing okay so far. But is it a reliable document? Because here's a logic question. What do you find out? That the Bible does a pretty good job, but the reason it does a pretty good job is we keep changing it every time we find out something new. Like, big scientific discovery in 1970s, and so now in the 1980s we're going to rewrite the Bible, so we're going to kind of fold that in there. Then can you trust the Bible? I would say no. So if you keep editing it every single time you get new information, no. But what if this book has been consistent for 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years, and every new scientific discovery, once it reaches the level of being confirmed, somehow still fits in this book? That the author of this book in some way, shape, or form has been writing such profound truth that lines up with the reality sufficiently well, allowing for poetry, that no matter what science is able to discover and confirm, this book is still not contradicting it. That would be a pretty amazing piece of work. And if the Bible that we have today is that same book from thousands of years ago, I would say that's got to be a really impressive piece of work. That's got to be a really impressive document. And if we're coming from the perspective that God created the heavens and the earth, the universe is the handiwork of some kind of a God, if a God is that powerful, and he decided he wanted to create a book, could he do that? He could. Would he do that? Well, I don't know. If it seems like some of his agenda here is love, he loves us, he wants us to love him, that he loves people, he wants us to love people, he wants us to have relationship, then maybe he would. So if he could, some of this hints that maybe he would. So we're going to take a look next at the Bible and see if the Bible is such a document that maybe that could be a way he is trying to communicate with us. Next time. So far we're just walking it out. Now you see, if you have a crisis of faith, you can hang on to your belief in a God. You can hang on to some measure of belief in Jesus Christ so far. And no matter how rattled you get, as you step it back, you've always got a place you can still hang on that will not be rattled by your crisis of faith. And next time we're going to walk into the Bible itself and establish the book, still without talking about individual theologies. but establish the book next time. Thank you.